So it says the northern horizon. That's the tail of the Little Dipper. Okay? And so then what you do is you say, okay, what time is it that I'm standing out here looking at the stars? It's 9 p.m. It's September the 20th. You'd mark that there, and that'll tell you where the stars are at. When you put this way and look up, you're like, oh, okay, the Little Dipper should be there. The Big Dipper should be, wherever it is on here.
That's cool that it adjusts.
It adjusts, yes. So basically what you can see is if you look at the stars, if you adjust this by the time of day that it is, in other words, if I said, hey, it's August 20th, and I hold my thumb there, and I go outside at 9 p.m. at night, that's where all the stars are. But by 2 in the morning, it looks different. It's because everything circles around that little guy there.
I downloaded that app.
Yeah.
I love it.
That's pretty cool, isn't it?
It's a lot easier.
So, yeah.
It is so cool.
Yeah, Skyview, Night Sky, any of those are great. Now, I will tell you, so Friday night, I'm sitting upstairs watching a movie. Kim's snoozing on the couch, and Joe comes up and says, hey, we're going to go outside and watch Starlink go overhead.
Yeah, we saw
I'm like, what? Was that amazing? Now, did you see it last night as well? It came across again last night. Yeah. So the space station's cool, but there is nothing like seeing Starlink. That is what it looked like. It's a giant bunch of satellites, and it literally looks like a train going across.
It's not going up like that. It's going across.
Yeah, I actually had my phone turned sideways.
Yeah.
But what you can, and what you're seeing is not like, oh, that was a time thing where it goes, no, that's all the different satellites that go in a row that go up there.
They shoot them up in a group.
Mm-hmm.
They fly together for 200.
until they get to the 200 mile, and then they rocket off.
And then they go to their individual.
Right. So,
I saw that. I thought it was like a track of where they were going to go or something.
no, and so what it is, yeah, they all fly together till they get to a certain height, and then off they go and go to where they're going to be. So you too can have uninterrupted, amazing internet service without any wires. And it's $599 for the service fee, and then it's $110 a month. And it's through one of these satellites. And so they're only 500 miles above us, as opposed to a normal satellite is at 56,000 miles or something like that. So it was pretty crazy. Anyway, just interesting stuff. We were talking about the sky and how cool God has done some stuff. Man's done some pretty cool stuff. Oh, you found the Jim's already ordering over here. All right, Jeremy, we're ready to go. Are we online yet? Oh, that's great. Good morning, everybody that's watching online. All right. We're in prophecy number 13, and we didn't finish it last week. I didn't realize that one was going to take quite a while for us to get into and go through. And so I just want to we're talking about Psalm 8 and the fact that most people read this psalm and are just like, well, this, as Ginger said last week, well, this doesn't have anything prophetic in it. I don't see anything referring to the Messiah. And yet when you go back to some of the original text and the original wording, you understand, holy smokes, this really was. The fact that the opening and closing verses really point to, it's what they call the proposition. It really points to how awesome God is and Jesus, right? And the one I was talking about last week, Dr. S.M. Lockridge, he's the one that preaches that message called That's My King, okay? And that's if you get an opportunity to see, look that up on YouTube. Type in That's My King, and that little video will come up of him preaching it. He's a black guy. He does a phenomenal job. I can't do it justice. But that really talks to that. Then we talked about verses 2 through 4, where we talked about the proof of who Jesus was and who God was. By the children admit to it, the heavens and the earth itself recognize him. And then we started in on this prophecy part, and that's really where we kind of we didn't get bogged down, but that's pretty much where we left off. And so I want to kind of pick it up there. And so the verses verses 4 through 8, when you look at those, let me get those called back up here. What is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? You have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet, all flocks and herds, and the animals of the wild, the birds in the sky, the fish in the sea, all that swim the path of the seas. Well, here's the interesting thing. The way that our version of the Bible is written is not really as close to the original in this particular sense that we need it to be. In the first half of verse 4, where it says, what is man that you are... what is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? The word that is used there, Enosh, is generically talking about a human being in our fleshly weakness. The Son of Man, which is in the second half of that verse, refers to Messiah. So really, the guy who wrote this through the Holy Spirit is given two illustrations. God takes note of man and his weakness, and that he visits the Son of Man, the Messiah. And the particular visitation that he's referring to is explained through the next verse, and that is where he says, our version says, you have made them a little lower than the angels. Okay? It's really, the word them can be translated also as him. Sorry, working on the voice thing. The Son of Man was made for a time to be lower than the angels. That's in verse 5. And the verb that is used there is chesar, which means to want or to lack. And interestingly, that word is not part of the creation vocabulary. In other words, if the author of the psalm had been speaking about the original creation of man, he would have used the word bara or asa or yatsar. Bara means to create, asa means to make, or yatsar means to form or to be used. But the word he used, which is chesar, it means to take away from something or to subtract or remove some of what already exists. In this case, he's talking about taking away the equality or the superiority so that one, I being the Messiah, is less than the angels. Now, you can only take something away of somebody who is superior to something else. For instance, Adam could not become less than an angel when he, in fact, had never previously been more than an angel. So, it literally points us to the incarnation of Jesus. Prior to entering the world, he existed in the form of God. He always was, right? He was the one that did the actual creation. And in Philippians 2:6-7, it says, he did not deem equality with God a thing to be clutched, but he emptied himself and made himself of no reputation. So we can actually look to the Hebrew text here, which says that God made the Son of Man to be less than Elohim, okay, which was the usual Old Testament word for God, okay? And the plural, or the Greek version of the Old Testament translated Elohim to angels. And that's how we end up by saying he made them a little lower than the angels. When the original Hebrew text says he made him a little lower than God. Okay? Now, the author asks this question. He says, in what sense was the Son of Man made lower than the angels? And that's where this big rub comes in. Is this really talking about the Messiah, or is it not talking about the Messiah? Think about this. When Jesus was born, when he became flesh, he took upon himself the form of a servant and became obedient unto death. And we know that angels are not subject to the limitations of a flesh and blood body. They may appear to be like one, but they're not subject to that. They have direct access to the presence of God. But the Son of Man, Jesus, during the duration of his earthly ministry, was subject to the frailties of the flesh. He experienced hunger, weariness, sorrow. He cried. He hurt, right? He did not have direct access to the Father. I don't know how that worked with him when he prayed and talked to God, but he didn't have, as a human body, he did not have direct access. He could not go in front of God, okay?
He was still fully God.
Fully God, right. That's the only way that he knew what God's will was for him. Yeah. Correct. Right. Like we would see in Job, where the description of the throne room is, and the angels are all coming to tell God, hey, what they've been up to that week. Okay. So in Psalms chapter 8, verse 5, the adverb miat, when they talk about a little lower in degree or rank, it has a sense of that. But the writer of Hebrews takes the adverb miat to have a temporal significance, which it sometimes has in Hebrew. Thus, the Son of Man was to be lowered beneath the angels for a little time. There's no evidence that man's ever going to be better than angels. We're ever going to go above them. There's no scriptural evidence for that. By the same token, if generic man is the subject of verses 5 through 8, then you have to conclude that the author of Hebrews has twisted the intended meaning of the adverb to make his messianic application. All of that basically means that's part of the argument that goes back and forth. Was this really talking about the Messiah, or are they just stretching it to make it talk about that?
Like then in Hebrews, because it quotes this exact
Mm-hmm.
passage. And they also translate it, at least in the NIV, them instead of him.
Mm-hmm.
So, just trying to figure it out. So in the NIV, are they trying to say that the them is a reference to the angels?
Let's see. That was in Hebrews 2:7, right?
Hebrews 1. Yeah, no, you're right. Chapter 2.
You made them a little lower than the angels.
It is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking.
Okay, wait a minute.
I mean, I was just
Yeah.
kind of curious. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, my footnotes in here show that in Hebrews, when he quotes this, when he says there's a place where someone has testified, what is mankind, that you are mindful of them, but it's actually him, a son of man, that you care for him. You made them for a little while lower than the angels. You crown them with glory and honor, put everything under their feet. And that's why you can't just take one chunk. You have to look at what the writer writes, because what the writer writes next. It's like that whole batch of verses together. Individually, you might be able to argue, oh, well, he's talking about a human being, or, oh, he's talking about the Messiah. But together, you find that all of these verses point directly to Jesus, right? Yeah.
It's just interesting to me is how, like, the translators of the NIV decided that we're going to translate that them instead of him.
Right. I don't understand that. There's obviously something there that they looked at and said, "Oh, this doesn't make sense," or "This makes more sense,"
Because, I mean,
because it doesn't.
like we said last week, I mean, those two words, it changes everything.
Mm-hmm.
Them and him.
Yeah.
And I'm not understanding this slightly lower for a period of time. Because if you go back to Genesis, it says, let us create.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what, it says that in Hebrews. Yeah. I mean, you go on to read in Hebrews chapter 2, but we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death forever. So they're saying he was lower than an angel at the time of creation, but yet
No. When he took on flesh.
when he took on flesh,
Yes. When he became human.
when he stopped being a spirit, became flesh.
Right. Does that make more sense?
That does make more sense.
Yes. You also have to remember that at some point in time, and let me go back to this. Let me get to the right scripture. Let me go back to Psalms 8. And it's in... If we translated some words here and transferred them around, what is a human being that you're mindful of them? human beings, that you care for them. You have made Jesus a little lower than the angels and crowned him with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet. There's a point in here where, that's Hebrews 2:7. Sorry. Go back to that. What I'm trying to get to is to show you that in translation, things get changed around. And that's what he's saying. Hebrews 2:7. You made them for a time, a little lower than the angels. That word that's translated angels right there is not really the word that the Old Testament uses for angels. The Old Testament uses Elohim, the plural Elohim. You have Elohim, which is God, and then you have Elohim plural, which most translators say, oh, he's talking about angels. Does that make sense? Correct. Yeah, so we have a whole bunch of words. They only had one word that meant, but they would understand by what went before it or after it or how the inflection was on it, what that meant. Okay? That is confusing. But if we just look at it from the standpoint of, okay, he's definitely talking about Jesus, because he goes on in verse 5 to talk about how the Son of Man was crowned with glory and honor. And interestingly, he says the nouns honor and glory are elsewhere put together to express royal dignity, anytime you see those two together. It's not a reference to the dominion given to Adam in the garden, but it's a reference bestowed upon the Son of Man after he died, after the Passion, when he was taken up into heaven in the presence of the adoring crowds. In Hebrews 1:6, I think, Kendall, you were just talking about that. Hebrews 1:6 says, and again, when God brings his firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. In speaking of the angels, he makes his angels spirits and his servants flames of fire. He crowned the Lord of all with angels, authorities, and powers being made subject unto him. 1 Peter 3:22 talks about that as well. So if you look at that picture, you can see that when you're talking about crowned with honor and glory, they're specifically talking about Jesus. The traditional interpretation of all of this was that, Adam was made lower than the angels at his creation. Well, how can he be made lower than angels if he was never there before? That's the argument that goes back and forth, okay? Literally, if we look at verses 6 through 8 of the Psalm, it begins to bring it back together again and show us that. Psalm 8, let me get to the right place here. You made them ruler over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet, all flocks, herds, the animals of the wild, the birds in the sky, the fish in the sea, all that swim the paths of the seas. It's obviously got to be talking about the Son of Man and the fact that all things were put under his feet. The imagery here is that of a victorious soldier placing his foot upon the neck of a vanquished foe. All creatures, domesticated or wild, fowl or fish, are under his rule. So,
If you look at it this way, okay, like God spoke everything into existence, but he formed man, so that was different, and he gave man dominion over all the other things of the earth.
but it's different. That's a different phrasing than the dominion he gave over Adam in the garden. Because Adam lost a lot of that dominion when he sinned. Now it was, now the animals are going to be mean to you. They're not going to like you, and they're going to, be afraid of you, kind of a thing. Okay. David obviously knew that kind of dominion was not present, and as the Spirit prompted him to write this, all he knew was the Messiah was going to make it right. Man has been forced to do daily battle with nature to regain his authority over creation. And what we see is that in Jesus, that dominion is fully realized, right? And he makes the point that all things are put under his feet. Christ reigns from his throne on high. Hebrews 2, you'll see that expression, all things under his feet, is used 2 times in the New Testament. It's in Ephesians 1:22, which is the reference of the authority of Christ in his church. And it's also in 1 Corinthians 15:25 through 27, which is the second coming and the consummation are just right around the corner there. So the 3 passages that he uses this in, he talks about the past, the present, and the future. All things were put under his feet at his ascension. All things are under his feet while he's reigning in the kingdom. And all things will be put under his feet at his coming. Does that make sense? A little more sense? Generic man is not the focus of Psalms 8, 5 through 8. Man does not have dominion over all things. It's Jesus is the one. Hebrews 2:5 says, the world in which we now live and in which when it shall have been purified from sin, the redeemed will live forever. That's what the apostle's talking about there. Okay, so we can look at Psalm 8 and yeah, a lot of digging and a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of, I won't say arguing between scholars, but there's a lot of discussion between scholars as to, was this really talking about man or is this really talking about Jesus? Okay, this particular author, James Smith, comes to the conclusion, it's talking about Jesus, it's Messianic. And when you read it, and as Kendall said earlier, you put the right words in the right place, then it suddenly begins to make sense. Okay?
It is interesting that in the Hebrews passage, it says, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? And then it says, a son of man that you care for him.
A son of man, singular.
Yes.
Yeah.
But back in Psalms, they say human beings
Mm-hmm.
care for them.
Yeah, the wording and the phraseology, and the only thing I can think of is because you're translating from Hebrew to English, which is one way, and Greek to English, which is another, and the words don't always mean the same. I mean,
In Hebrews, the whole thing is about Jesus.
right,
And that's the context.
right. I have heard a lot of scholars say that you've not read the Bible until you read it in the original Hebrew, like what the Hebrew means. I've heard them say that. I'm like, I don't. Do what? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, the understanding of it, I think, is the thing.
I tell you what, Philippians does a pretty good job, too.
My thing here has a footnote for Psalm 144:3. It
So-
says, Lord, what are human beings that you care for them? And it's in reference to Psalm
144:3, you said?
144:3.
We're mere mortals that you think of them. They are like a breath, their days are like a fleeting shadow, yeah. So he's talking about, in that first reference, he's definitely talking about the frail human beings. And then that second reference, the a son of man, where he's talking about Jesus. Yep.
Philippians 2, basically 1 through 11, talks about the transition, basically, from the Spirit and of the Spirit's responsibilities to the a little bit lower status of a human.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the time of the resurrection, back to the fullness where he becomes the Lord of Lords, God of all people, in heaven, on earth, and under the earth.
Yeah.
So, and I get it now, kind of. I don't like the way it's worded in Psalm.
Yeah. That's what I said. The frustrating part is, you read the Bible, you assume, okay, I'm reading a correct translation of it. And the reality is, man, until you dig in deep, you may not ever know that the translation has some variations in it that give it a completely different meaning.
Well, it never becomes a responsibility to identify who is being spoken of by the word man.
Right.
And its different levels of what a man can be, like
Right.
the son of man.
Right.
You got to know that in there going into it.
Yes.
But the only problem is you got to have the New Testament to tell you what was written in
To-
the Old Testament.
Well, yeah, that's a lot of times they'll use the New Testament and look back and go, oh, this is what this means, without digging extremely deep into the original meaning of it to understand, oh, okay, this is definitely pointing back, or in this case, pointing forward to this is going to be the Messiah.
At least I have one. Let me put it in my problems with Baptists.
You're not the only one, Jim. I struggled through this one. I was like, this is deep. There's a lot of stuff in this one.
To say I don't know that I am still, well, I don't want to say buying into, because that implies the wrong thing.
Yeah.
But I can say that I'm still sold on the idea that Psalm 8 is messianic, but it's not a salvation issue. It's something. I'm not hitting off those keys. I've listened, I've read it, I've thought about it.
Yeah.
I'm still not convinced.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is that doesn't really, I don't know,
Right.
getting off in the weeds, so I can just let it go.
You know what? If that one's not messianic, what about the other 77? Or 76. So you're right. You're exactly right. That's not a thing.
Rock and roll, in other words.
That's right, man. Here we go. All right, let's get through Psalm 40 because it's a lot. There's not nearly as much depth in this one, all right? Psalm 40, I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and the mire. He set my feet on a rock, gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord, put their trust in him. Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, who does not look to the proud, to those who turn aside to false gods. Many, Lord my God, are the wonders you have done, the things you planned for us. None can compare with you. Were I to speak and tell of your deeds, they would be too many to declare. Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but my ears you have opened. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not require. Then I said, here I am. I have come. It is written about me in the scroll. I desire to do your will, my God. Your law is within my heart. I proclaim your saving acts in the great assembly. I do not seal my lips, Lord. As you know, I do not hide your righteousness in my heart. I speak of your faithfulness, your saving help. I do not conceal your love and your faithfulness from the great assembly. Do not withhold your mercy from me, Lord. May your love and faithfulness always protect me, for troubles without number surround me. My sins have overtaken me. I cannot see. They are more than the hairs of my head, and my heart fails within me. Be pleased to save me, Lord. Come quickly, Lord, to help me. May all who want to take my life be put to shame and confusion. May all who desire my ruin be turned back in disgrace. May those who say to me, aha, aha, be appalled at their own shame. But may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who long for your saving help always say, the Lord is great. But as for me, I am poor and needy. May the Lord think of me. You are my help and my deliverer. You are my God. Do not delay. Now, interestingly enough, there are 3 verses in Psalm 40 that are quoted in Hebrews 10, 5 through 7. Okay? According to the inspired author of that New Testament book, Paul, Jesus, the Lord, is speaking to the Father at the time he left heaven to come into the world. And if we look at Hebrews, let me jump up to that real quick. It's the only thing I don't like about this particular version on the Bible app is you can't have your finger in a couple of places. You can't hold places at the same time. Hebrews 10, 5 through 7. Therefore, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. With burnt offerings and sin offerings you were not pleased. Then I said, here I am. It is written about me in the scroll. I have come to do your will, my God. And that's from Psalm 40, verses 6 through 8. Clearly. Several Psalms have the title which is found at the beginning of Psalm 40. Which if we look at, it says, for the chief musician. Now, this was something that, I've studied Psalms a lot and things like that and never really paid, I read that, but I never pay huge attention to that stuff. But it clearly shows that the Psalm was not a mere expression of personal feeling, but that it was designed for permanent and public use. Some commentators see in the psalm an allusion to David's deliverance from Absalom. Others think the psalm reflects David's attitude following his sin with Bathsheba. But both suggestions can be labeled as merely speculation because that psalm is speaking about Jesus and what's going to happen just before Bethlehem. Okay? Most scholars see a clear division in Psalm 40 after verse 10. So basically, they think that verses 1 through 10 were originally a psalm, and verses 11 through 17 were maybe another. And for some bizarre reason, they were put together. And I thought that was interesting. For the purpose of today's discussion, we're going to use we're going to break this up into six areas. The psalm speaks of a great deliverance. That's in verses 1 through 4, wherein Jesus heard the cry, God heard the cry. His feet were set on a rock. That's your deliverer, Jesus' feet. Many will come to trust and fear him. And then literally there's a beatitude that's given there in verse 4, where he talks about, blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, who does not look to the proud, to those who turn aside to false gods. So we see that. And secondly, there was a program. There was a particular way that this was going to work out, that God had launched this program. And that was, he starts it out with a prayer in verse 5. Many, Lord my God, are the wonders you have done, the things you've planned for us, none compare with you. Were I to speak and tell of your deeds, they would be too many to declare. And then, how does God look at sacrifices? We see that in verse 6. Sacrifice and offering you didn't desire. This is weird, but bear with me. Okay? But my ears you have opened. Some Septuagint manuscripts read, but a body you have prepared for me. Okay, so let's talk about those two things, because that's pretty critical to this whole passage and understanding that, okay?
Where's that put?
Verse 6. Yeah, I'm sorry. 40, verse 6. Jesus accomplished by one offering of himself what all the Old Testament offerings could not accomplish, right? And that was to completely do away with sin. The sacrifice offered on Calvary it not only removed any further obligation, but it ended the entire system under which the Mosaic sacrifice had been set up. So we understand that as the first part of that, but then this whole my ears you have opened, or a body you have prepared for me. So here's what's interesting. The verb opened, which is kara, has a meaning which is pierced. Not just opened like I opened my mouth, but opened like you pierced something. Okay, you know, when you pierce something, it opens up. All right. The reference may be a reference to a law by which a servant could, because of love, commit himself in perpetuity to the service of his master. In other words, if I was your slave and I said, you know what, you always treated me good, I'm going to be your slave forever. I would go out to a doorpost and the master would take an awl and poke my ear, shove that awl into the door, poke that, and they put a ring in that, and then I would be your servant forever. Okay? So keep that picture.
Does that mean that the servant was kind of a free person, but he chose to stay with the master?
Yes. Yes. He chose to stay with that individual. Having the earlobe pierced was a badge of that commitment. But what would it mean for God to pierce the ear of the Messiah? Well, here's what they say. The opening of the ear is equivalent to causing one to hear something. But more than that is involved. The writer of Hebrews, who follows the Septuagint version, renders the clause, a body you have prepared for me. So how do you reconcile that with the literal translation of the Hebrew, ears you have pierced for me? Okay? You guys following me? So one version, which is the Psalm, says, you pierced my ear. The Hebrew version says, you prepared a body for me. How do you put those two together and make that work? Okay? The Septuagint version, which is the ear piercing, was the common version of the first Christian century. Sometimes New Testament writers use that version in spite of its inaccuracy and even quote passages which were inaccurately translated. Okay? When the Septuagint does not express correctly the meaning of the original, then the writer of Hebrews either modified the rendering so as to make it correct or offers a new translation of the Hebrew. In this particular version of Psalm 40, several slight departures from the Septuagint translation are evident. If you insist on a logical connection between piercing the ear and preparing a body, it may lie in this. Where there is an ear, there has to be a body. I was like, okay, that's a pretty basic line to follow here. The piercing of the ear was a token that a servant belonged wholly to his master. When the ear of the heavenly servant is pierced in love, God gets the whole body. It's like, okay, I can kind of follow that. Doesn't give me a lot of like rock to stand on and go, if I ever had to argue this, I don't know that I could, right? Think about this. Either way you explain it, the original Hebrew is not altered by how they've rendered the Septuagint and the book of Hebrews or the Bible. The Septuagint has given the whole body, while the psalmist expressed only part of the body. Okay? And he goes on to say, if you continue down through this, you'll see that maybe this makes more sense. In verse 7, the words, "Behold, I come," declares the Messiah's intention to enter the world of time and space. The connective word "then" follows behind it. These circumstances indicate the particular act of obedience which the Messiah was to perform. This just, to me, gets really like out in the weeds with some of these things. It's like, okay, is it or isn't it? And then you have all of these arguments and discussions. But go ahead.
No, I'm just laughing at it because I know what you mean.
Man, it's real easy. You're just like, what in the world is he, where's he going with this? And what's he trying to say? Jesus understood that the scroll of the book, where he says, the scroll of the book is written about me in verse 7, had to have been the Old Testament, obviously, okay? I just think in reading this and studying this, you understand, okay, it's very clear that sacrifice and offering you did not desire. And if you begin to translate some of these phrases in there, sacrifice and offering you didn't desire, but you prepared a body for me and that I'm going to be your servant of, okay? Burnt offerings and sin offerings you didn't require. You required a body. Then I said, here I am, I've come. It's written about me in the scroll. And we know that that's a reference specifically. Jesus, 2 times, 3 times? Put it down and said, today this is fulfilled in your presence. Whoa! And everybody had a hissy fit about that. Okay? I desire to do your will, my God. Your law is within my heart. We know very clearly Jesus delighted to do the will of God. He proclaimed God's righteousness. And then there was these public concepts of, well, what is this whole righteousness thing? Well, God's righteousness, God's faithfulness, his salvation, his loving kindness, and the truth of God, which has never been proven incorrect or false. All right? Again, I think some of this gets into the weeds. I think you can clearly read this and go, oh, yeah, I can make the connection there. That makes sense to me, that he's talking about Jesus and that Jesus was going to come, right? The fact that, hey, God, don't forget about me when I'm on the cross and going through all of this, right? And then he wraps the whole thing up by talking about, okay, let me tell you what's going to happen to all of our adversaries, what their fate's going to be. And then he finishes in verse 16 with, what are the fate of my followers? And that is, but may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who long for your saving help always say, the Lord is great. But as for me, I'm poor and needy. May the Lord think of me. You are my help and my redeemer. You are my God. Do not delay. I think David's talking about himself there after he's talked all of these things about the Messiah. Okay? Again, I know this gets a little bit, it did for me in digging through it and studying it and going, how much of this do you really get into with this? Or do you say, look, this is Messianic in generality?
Well, there's no doubt that the Hebrew writer took a portion of this, 3 or 4 verses, whatever it was, and applied that to Jesus.
Correct. And that's where we have to lean to go, okay, that makes sense to me that he was talking about Jesus. Because Paul obviously saw that. And Paul would have known the original Hebrew way better than you or I. All right? Okay. We'll get into some more next week. I'm going to try and boil it down to be a little clearer next week so that we don't have quite the woo. that gets involved in some of this. All right, you guys have been good listeners. Thank you.